Asterisk, this is not a sudden collapse or a dramatic betrayal played out on television. What is happening is far more consequential because it is quieter, slower, and rooted in strategic decisions rather than emotional reactions. As 2026 advances, the transatlantic alliance that once formed the backbone of global stability is undergoing a structural realignment that few are willing to openly admit. The defining moment did not arrive with a crisis or a war, but with doctrine. The release of the 2026 United States National Defense Strategy marked a turning point that European capitals had anticipated but hoped to avoid. For the first time in the modern security era, Europe is no longer described as a primary strategic theater. The United States has openly declared that its core priorities are homeland defense and the Indo-Pacific region, with China identified as the central long-term challenge. Europe, by contrast, is framed as capable of managing its own security environment with reduced American involvement. In Washington, this language reflects focus and efficiency. In Europe, it is read as conditional commitment, and in geopolitics, conditional commitment alters behavior immediately. Once protection is no longer guaranteed by default, dependence becomes risk. Germany's response illustrates this shift clearly. For decades, Berlin operated under the assumption that American extended deterrence was permanent and unquestionable. That assumption is now under review. The nuclear sharing framework, long treated as a symbol of alliance cohesion, has become a subject of internal reassessment. Facilities linked to U.S. nuclear deployments under NATO arrangements are no longer viewed as immutable fixtures, but as negotiable policy instruments. Reviews of modernization schedules, access protocols, and sovereignty clauses have intensified. Officially, these processes are described as technical and administrative. Strategically, they reflect a deeper concern. Control without certainty is vulnerability. Under existing arrangements, nuclear weapons stationed in Europe remain under American command authority. European allies host, maintain, and integrate these systems, but the final decision rests elsewhere. In a world where Europe is no longer a primary strategic priority, this imbalance becomes politically and strategically difficult to justify. France approaches the same dilemma through a different historical tradition. Paris has always emphasized strategic autonomy and deliberately preserved its independent, nuclear, deterrent outside full NATO integration. The logic behind this posture was never ideological isolation, but continuity of survival. National existence cannot depend on external political calculations. As arms control frameworks weaken and global competition intensifies, this logic is now being projected beyond France itself. French leadership increasingly frames European defense as a European responsibility rather than a permanently outsourced function. This has opened discussions on deeper Franco-German coordination and long-term deterrence concepts designed to function even if American priorities continue to shift. Asterisk, the timing of this reassessment amplifies its urgency. In February 2026, the New START Treaty reaches its expiration without a successor in place. With that expiration, the final legally binding limits on U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals disappear. Verification mechanisms end. Data exchanges stop. The framework that once imposed predictability on nuclear competition dissolves. China remains outside these constraints entirely, accelerating its own capabilities without formal limitation. European policymakers are therefore confronting a strategic environment defined by uncertainty at the highest level. In such an environment, dependence without influence becomes liability. The response has extended beyond weapon systems alone. Intelligence architectures are being reassessed with renewed emphasis on European-controlled assets, including satellites, data processing networks, and threat analysis capabilities. For decades, American intelligence dominance formed the backbone of NATO's situational awareness. That dominance provided efficiency, but also dependency. Diversification is now increasingly framed as resilience rather than duplication. Economic pressures reinforce the same strategic logic. Trade disputes, tariff threats, and economic coercion have highlighted how closely security and economics are intertwined. European governments are revisiting assumptions that once appeared stable under the expectation of permanent American alignment. Energy policy sits at the center of this transformation. Germany's decision to phase out nuclear energy was driven by domestic consensus, but its strategic consequences are now being openly acknowledged. High electricity costs, industrial strain, and increased external dependence have reframed nuclear power from a purely environmental debate into a national security issue. Berlin and Paris are aligning on expanded nuclear energy strategies, advanced reactor development, and long-term fusion research as pillars of European technological sovereignty. This shift is not about abandoning climate goals, but about reducing strategic exposure. When energy, defense, and economics are all externally leveraged, autonomy erodes rapidly. Taken together, these developments point to a controlled divergence rather than an explosive rupture. The United States is not withdrawing from global influence, but consolidating its focus around its own priorities. Europe is not rejecting partnership, but but adapting to reduced certainty. Two security architectures are emerging where once there was a single integrated system. The post-war Atlantic order is not ending through confrontation, but through recalibration. America has chosen to prioritize itself and the Pacific theater. Europe has chosen not to remain dependent on guarantees that may no longer be automatic. In this new landscape, the United States remains a dominant power, but no longer the unquestioned center of European security planning. Influence is being redistributed, not erased. For the first time in generations, America is first by choice and increasingly alone by structure. Asterisk,